Airport employees of Reddit, what is the strangest, funniest, scariest thing that happened at your airport? Pittsburgh International. 3 AM or so several years ago. Watched an older woman tumble down the up escalator. Every time she flipped over she yelled "I'm okay" like Filbert from Rocko's Modern Life. Flop. I'm okay. Flop. I'm okay. Flop. I'm okay. Rolled in place for maybe a minute before someone shut the thing off. Airports employ falconers. The birds are used to keep other birds away from aircraft. Because a bird in an engine can really mess up someone's day. So this falconer had come into the airport with his bird to grab a cup of coffee. He decided to try to impress some ladies by taking the hawk's hood off and doing a little demonstration. What he failed to notice was the starlings resting outside on a steel beam. Hawk flew after starlings, smoked the glass and broke its neck. Thousands of dollars worth of highly trained bird gone. I work at my local airport. I live on a tiny island and this airport is smaller than our library. And just last summer we had a hurricane looming down on us. Everyone is getting packed up to evacuate. We're renting cars like crazy to people fleeing and we're trying to get them out of the storm area. I was out checking on the cars we had and when I walked back up there was a man sitting on a bench out front. With an apocalyptic looking storm bearing down on us. Wind whipping everywhere. Just soulfully playing the trombone. No idea where he came from or what he was doing but it was surreal. Like something out of a David Lynch film. Edit, to clarify. This island is tiny. But it is also very closed off the coast and has a bridge to the mainland. I worked at a corporate aircraft maintenance place. And we had a situation where this crazy woman somehow got out on the secured ramp area. By the time one of our line service guys saw her she had the main entry door opened up on a Global XRS aircraft. When he pulled up she looked at him and asked if he could help her get her bags and boat. When he told her he couldn't, she told him she was going to fly the plane to China and didn't want to be late. After that occurrence the security at our airport became insane. I was at the airport one day, waiting for my girlfriend to come pick me after my flight. She was about 20 minutes away so I sat down by a window ledge to read it, obviously. And like normal there were various airport employees, security people, passengers, etc. wandering around. After about 5 minutes, I notice a couple cops with a dog eyeing me up. They go to walk by. And all of a sudden the dog gets really close to me and then sit down. The cops give me an intense look. And reach under the ledge where I was sitting. All of a sudden, they pull out a bag with a few grams of weed in it. This is not my weed. And I start freaking out internally. Like any normal person. One of the cops goes, "What's this all about?" Then, the other cop bursts out laughing. And explains that they are doing canine training and I happened to sit down right over the exact spot they had previously hidden the bag of weed for the dog to find. The cops were laughing so hard they had to take a couple-minute break from their training. And after my blood pressure kinda returned to normal I thought it was pretty funny too. Edit, I should have mentioned I had at least 300 feet of window ledge to choose where to sit. And I happened to pick that exact spot. Worked at Perth Airport until recently. Most flights in Perth go to Bali and you see some right characters. Read, Bali Bogans. A Jetstar flight was delayed by 7 hours and a woman and her husband used the time to get absolutely it-faced. The woman fancied a cigarette and rather than go outside and go through security again, lit up in the middle of the duty-free. My colleagues quickly tried to stop her. But she told them to duck off. Cue airport police. $10,000 fine and no flight to Bali. Should have listened to the staff. My time to shine. Most of the airport work is mundane but you will get the odd passenger that leaves an impression on you. There was a group of people coming through for a business trip and their boss had never flown before. One of his employees came in and explained they told him he needed dental records for TSA and wanted us to play along. So the boss comes in and hands me his ID and an x-ray from his dentist to check in for his flight. Trying not to laugh, I show it to my coworker who points at it and says, Well, Tar might have an issue with that. Dude's face went white as a sheet until his employees busted up laughing. He got super red in the face and eventually started laughing at himself. Never let it be said that airports are humorless places. I used to do cargo for Delta and British Airways. We ship a lot of dead people. A lot of animals. Too. They actually send me to LA to go to a class entirely on animal handling. Here's regulations and procedures for everything all the way up to elephants and whales and sheet. Weirdest thing we ever got to actually ship was an alligator of some sort. Wasn't funny in any way. But this guy had to bring the ugliest dog I have ever seen to the airport and send it to his ex-wife so that she could put it down. She hated him and the dog, but she had a better lawyer. Guy was a big burly dude fighting back tears the whole time and asked if he could take him out to play with him in the grass one more time. What? Like he lost custody of dog Dart? Yes. And she told him as soon as she sees it she is putting it down. Damn, dog was as happy as could be without a clue in the world. This happened like 30 years ago and I still can picture the whole thing like it was yesterday. Not me. But my father was regional manager of one of the rental car companies at the airport, and on 9/11 when all flights were grounded everyone needed rental cars and it was havoc. My father said the phone rang and he almost didn't answer because he was so busy. Turns out it was the company CEO and ordered him to hand out keys free. No cost. No documentation, as the situation was severe and all other major rental companies followed suit. Not necessarily strange, funny or scary, but it is one of the few stories he told me about the job as a kid that I always remember. Not me, but a guy I once met. He works at the counter for a big local airline. There was a lady about mid to late 50s about to board with 4 big suitcases. This was a time when you normally could bring up to 2 suitcases or 23 kilograms. He notices this and tells the lady she would have to pay for the extra 2 suitcases. The lady nonchalantly says, "Oh, my husband is carrying those." He asks about her husband and again, completely relaxed and in a natural voice, she points at the plane and answers that's him in the coffin. After that he apologizes and let the lady board. Edit, a little bit of clarification. Edit 2.7k upvotes? Damn. My parents worked in airports and told me this story that happened sometime in the late 70s. They notice a patch of purple on the marble floor near the check-in queue. Thinking someone has spilled their red wine on the floor, a cleaner comes over and clears it up. About half an hour later, there's another pool of purple. A different cleaner comes along, clears it up. Eventually the original cleaner comes back, notices the same pool he cleared up already is back. He doesn't know what's going on. He looks up. There's an air vent, dripping something. Maybe it's air conditioning coolant or something. He reports it to his supervisor. Nothing happens for a day or two. They just keep mopping up this coolant. Eventually they send an air con tech into the roof. He comes back down the ladder, white as a sheet. It's a body. Turns out someone had tried to break past security by climbing through the air ducts. This is pre-Die Hard. Remember? So quite clever. Wasn't so clever was taking a wrong turn in the dark and falling 30 feet into a fan mechanism drop. Smoosh. Not me, but a friend. He used to work refueling planes. Most days during lunch he would sit in the airport and do some people watching. Anyway, a cart with a bunch of baggage rolls by and the bag on the end falls off without anyone noticing but him. After some time security is notified of the unknown bag. Taking all precautions, security bring in the gum sniffing dog to check it out. The dog sniffs it for a second and then all of a sudden begins to hump the bag. This was all before 9/11. Not an employee but a passenger. I got flagged for a random pat down and the agent asked me if I had any metal in my body. To which I said, I have an IUD. The agent freaks out and starts flagging other agents over. She musters all her calm and says, "Please repeat that you have an IUD on you," to which I had to say no. An IUD. A copper intrauterine device. For birth control. She didn't know what an IUD was. I bet she'll remember now. A little different. But I work avionics on F-22s in the Air Force. Most of the work is done outside. One day on mid-shift we get told to go inside, turn off the lights, and not look outside. Not knowing what the hell was going on, we obviously complied. Once everyone was inside, the big stadium lights that covered the entire airfield were turned off and all the entire airfield was dark. We heard low rumbling in the distance that was getting closer and rumors started flying. We were under attack. Aliens. You name it. Eventually we could hear 3 large planes fly very low overhead and be gone. After 15 more minutes we were given the go-ahead to go back outside and back to work. To this day I still don't know what the hell happened. Not an employee. Dad ran a business in Missouri and hired a mechanic who ended up being horrible. Left his tools everywhere. Trucks he worked on would break down. Everything was covered in oily fingerprints. etc. Employee was fired and forgotten. Fast forward a few years. My parents are on their honeymoon in Cancun getting on the plane to come back home. When the pilot announces over the PA system that the plane can't take off for a while because of maintenance, my dad looks out the window at the wing and sees oily fingerprints and tools all over the wing and the ground. His old mechanic walks out from under the wing and begins working under a panel on the wing. Dad gets super worried and wants off the plane immediately. Edit for all the questions. No. He didn't get off, since they'd paid for the flight. I don't think mom was going to let them leave in a million years. They made it safely home. Or I wouldn't be here to tell you all the story. I was cabin crew doing a turnaround from Dubai, UAE to Muscat, Oman and back again. We're on ground in Muscat and hear from ground staff to take extra care of a passenger who is about to board. She was an English lady in her 50s. As you can imagine. Well turned out but unassuming all the same. But she looked completely shaken when she boarded. So what happened was, she had checked in her luggage and had gone on to security. She placed her trolley bag on the conveyor belt and she went ahead through the metal detector and was waiting on the other side for her bag. Next thing she knows she's being detained. Placed in handcuffs and taken to a room for questioning. They take in her bag and start questioning her. Airport police officer, did you pack this bag yourself? Lady, yes. Airport police, so you know what's in the bag? Lady, yes, and goes about describing what's in the bag. The questioning goes on for a while and is quite aggressive. The police officer then opens up the bag and right on top of everything is this parcel filled with marijuana. She's aghast and protests her innocence. Doesn't know anything about it. This poor lady is completely distraught. The gravity of it is hitting her and she's inconsolable. Drug trafficking anywhere is a big no-no. But in Middle Eastern countries it can end up giving you the death penalty. The officers reviewed the footage of when her bag was scanned. And when she placed her bag on the belt and turned away, a man standing right behind her in seconds undid the zips and slipped it in. She had no idea who this man was. So she was let go and free to continue traveling, but her trolley bag was confiscated as evidence. She wasn't too worried about the bag at that stage. I got her a very big brandy. Lesson to be learned is to not let your bags out of your sight. Even for a second. I was not an airport employee, but was shadowing employees as part of a pilot training program. One of our rotations was to spend a few days with the fire department. Not much action, fortunately. But the fire station was in the middle of the airfield. So the view was epic. The Virginia Air National Guard operated F-16s from the airport at the time. They would go out 3 jets at a time. And would land 1, 2, 3 in quick succession. I was in the fire station when 3 F-16s were on short final to land. The tower asked a bizjet to hold short of their arrival runway. The bizjet either didn't hear or misunderstood and rolled out onto the runway. The tower told the F-16s to go around. The lead jet banked a hard left, followed by the number 2 jet. But number 3 kept coming. Deer down. Landing light on. The tower called to the number 3 jet to go around. Ang radios are encrypted, so we could only hear the tower talking. Not the F-16. The number 3 jet was still coming. The biz jet had nowhere to go and the firefighters started getting antsy. The number 3 F-16 flew directly over the top of the biz jet. Simultaneously pulled up his gear and hit the afterburner. Barreled half the length of the runway. Then pulled up hard left to join his buddies. The F-16 probably cleared the biz jet by 100 feet. But it seemed a lot closer to us in the fire station. And I'm sure even closer to the NOV biz jet pilot. The firefighters found it hilarious. TLDR, F-16 pilot sets biz jet pilot's underpants to code brown using afterburner. I work the cargo ramp. We're at the very edge of the main runway. And there's a marshy area about 200 feet from the end of the runway. One day we saw a pickup roll out on the service road near the marsh. And hear several shotgun blasts. A couple minutes later, the airport guys in the truck roll up and ask if anyone wants some free geese. One of our crew took 2 dead geese home and smoked them for us. Delicious. Apparently, the geese were just coming right back to that spot if they were forcibly relocated. So they had to be permanently removed. A school friend's father worked on passport control at Gatwick in the mid-80s. In those days passports were often handwritten and had spaces for things like distinguishing features. One day a young woman presented her passport to him. And he opened it and compared the photo. And then paused before saying this is a bit unusual. He showed her the open passport which read in part, distinguishing features, big tits. She exclaimed, my bloody brother. I'll heal him. Not an employee. But I was in LaGuardia Airport, Nick, when there was a bomb threat. It's crazy how you could easily tell who's from Nick and who's not. New Yorkers literally don't give a shit. They are already in LaGuardia. What more could life possibly do to them? Not an airport employee, but my dad is. I'm sure he's got many stories, but my favorite is one I also experienced. We're in the TSA line as a family. On our way to visit family across the country. The line is its regular slow self. But we're nearing the point where we have to take off our shoes and belts and whatnot. Suddenly, there's a commotion in front of us. Where people pick us their bags after scanning. A woman has packed the following things into her carry-on and is refusing to hear TSA when they tell her she can't take them on. A full-size Costco double pack of peanut butter. A toaster, the kind that flings your toast in the air. A blender with blade. I'm sure there were other things too. But I have never forgotten those 3 things being slowly pulled out of her bag. I was an F-16 crew chief, so I sort of worked at an airport. I was only a guardsman, so I didn't see too many crazy things, but one of the jets dumped about 40 gallons of JP-8 jet fuel out of its rear wing onto the ground and my friend while he was doing a pre-flight inspection. IDKY, but my first instinct was that sheet is going to ignite because the jet was on. It didn't, so it was just funny seeing my friend's pants soaked with jet fuel. I was in the San Juan PR airport in the American Airlines terminal on the morning of the 10th anniversary of 9/11. At 8 AM everything came to a halt and there was a call for a minute of silence. All American Airlines employees just stopped. Hung their heads and slowly everyone else stopped talking. It was pretty much quiet other than traffic and some industrial hum. It went from controlled chaos to stillness and back. Worked for a summer as a sky cap at an airport in Maine. A couple of the 9/11 hijackers came through that airport. And then to Logan, in Boston, which is where the hijacking took place. They chose this airport in Portland precisely because it was kinda podunk and no one would pay attention as much. A guy I worked with actually showed them to where the rental car place was because the way the airport was set up back then, it was in this weird corner and people would ask for our help to find it constantly. Poor guy felt like he was in some way responsible. On the way back through TSA from a class trip to Germany, one of my classmates got pulled aside from the group because he bought gummy bears in bulk from a Haribo store and they thought he was smuggling something in them. Dude just really liked gummies. One time a couple of us were wing walking a 757 back from the gate while our ACMX guy drove the pushback. After the jet is backed up, we're supposed to detach the pushback vehicle from the tow bar. then detach the tow bar from the plane's landing gear, and reattach the tow bar to the pushback vehicle. That day, the 757's parking brake failed, and as we detached from the pushback, the plane started rolling toward us with the engines running. Looking up at a 100,000-pound vehicle that's already basically on top of me while the engines came toward me was quite the experience. The captain had to stand on his pedal brake to stop the plane rolling so we could finish and get clear. Both the other people with me immediately went out for a smoke. Doctors of Reddit, what made you say how are you still alive? Patient stabbed himself in the neck with a thermometer that pierced his trachea. Missed all the important arteries, carotids, vertebrals, just hit some minor nerves. Good guy patient provided his own temperature reads until they removed the thermometer. My dad's a doctor, so I asked him. Someone walked in the front door with a kitchen knife sticking out between his eyes to the handle. The knife went through his sinus cavity and ended with the tip in his throat, millimeters from his brainstem. He goes into surgery and walks out of the ICU the next day. My dad says he is the luckiest man he ever saw. Blood alcohol of 0.730. Too much blood in their alcohol system. I had a guy with a Bowie knife sticking out of his chest. The knife was pulsating. I could literally count his pulse from across the room. Sounds like the knife was preventing blood loss then? Yep. A lot of the time you don't want to pull the knife or bullet or shrapnel out of someone because it's integral to keeping them alive. Hemoglobin of 35, 3.5. In a 35-year-old guy with a chronic rectal bleed he refused to have looked into for months because he didn't want anyone looking at his bumhole. Finally brought to the ER by ambulance when he fainted. Aka started dying in a grocery store. Guy had an argument with his girlfriend. Wanted to leave the apartment. Instead of taking the door, was real angry and jumped off the balcony. Fell down 40 feet directly on his heels on cement. He ended up having an ankle sprain. I wondered how he managed previous issues in his life. Guy comes in with a bit of chest pain. Tells me the big coronary artery on the front of the heart was 100% blocked. I tell him, who told you that? He says his doctor did about 10 years ago. I don't believe him since patients never ever get any of the stuff their doctor tells them right. I let the cardiac surgeon know what this guy said and he too goes at a 100%. So he's dead? If the biggest coronary artery is totally occluded and for 10 years no less, you are a dead man. Lo and behold, we get an angiogram and it was ducking 100% occluded. The artery on the back of the heart made a connection with the front of the heart to pick up the slack. It was some lucky shit. I used to work as a clerk in diagnostic imaging at a hospital, and we had a man come in for an x-ray complaining of chest pain. His records showed his last visit was 2 years prior when he got drunk and fell into a fish tank, breaking it. ER stitched him up and sent him home. Fast forward 2 years, and we are all gathered around the computer screen looking at an x-ray that showed a 12-inch long piece of fish tank glass sitting in his chest, with his aorta resting right on top of it. It was on an angle running from his left shoulder down towards his right hip. There were other shards of glass too, but this one was the biggest. Emergency surgery happened right away. Edit, to help clarify. This happened in Canada. Edit, I obviously didn't pick up correct info from the conversations that day the whole tempered glass situation. Sorry. Simply meeting someone who was 110 years old. Working as a phlebotomist. I've been slapped by a patient old enough to remember a good chunk of WWI. I wasn't even that mad. It was like getting hit by history. Had a patient come in confused and delirious because his kidneys were shutting down. He had multiple myeloma and a history of colon cancer plus a bunch of other things. He was jaundiced and needed to be shocked several times. The physicians, residents, and even the family thought he was going to die. The man insisted on full measures to keep him alive. He recovered in the span of 5 days. His kidneys improved. His delirium evaporated. And the man ducking walked out of the ICU. Then there was the guy who had to be castrated, but that's another story. About 20 years ago, I had a patient come in with obstruction of his colon by a large colon cancer. The cancer had spread to his liver, and CT scan showed the liver basically replaced by metastatic tumor. So he wouldn't die on intestinal obstruction. I won't go into detail, but trust me, it is a very unpleasant way to die. The patient, his family, and I decided to try placing an expandable metal stent through the tumor. It worked. His obstruction was relieved and he was able to go home to spend his last days with his family. 18 months later the patient came in for an office visit, for heartburn. He was even more jaundiced than when I first met him. But he felt basically well and was eating well. The stent was still functioning. I never saw him again and assume he finally succumbed to his disease. But he got at least 18 months of precious and really good time. Not a doctor, but been a paramedic 15 years. Had an 8-year-old kid on a ripstick, similar to a skateboard, lose control and roll into the path of an oncoming SUV in his neighborhood. He was hit by then run over by it. We arrived to find him face down under the vehicle. Unconscious. Barely breathing. After all was said and done he had bilateral femur fractures, one lower leg fracture, multiple rib fractures, a blown pupil, and open skull fracture, subdural brain bleed, attention pneumo, air escaping lungs into the chest cavity will squish the lungs and heart if untreated. And when we were bagging him, breathing for him, we felt subcutaneous emphysema, free air that crackles like Rice Krispies bubble wrap, in his hip. Yes, hip. We flew him to the children's hospital expecting him to die within the hour. He was in a coma for days and had to have multiple surgeries, but made a complete recovery, 100% neurologically intact as well, and graduates high school in the spring. His was such an amazing case the hospital made him one of their miracle kids of the year. Parents, please make your kids wear helmets. Even in the neighborhood. It wouldn't have prevented all of his injuries, but would have substantially lessened the brain trauma he suffered. They got his age wrong in this. Yow to be. Not a doctor, but encountered a woman that was shot blank in the head by her boyfriend. Bullet entered one of her eye sockets and exited above her and ear on the same side. She called 911 on her own and survived. Was in NICU for weeks. And testified against the bastard who is now thankfully in prison. Crazy how one person can get shot in the head and survive while another can trip on the sidewalk and hit their head in just the right way. Nurse here. 50-year-old male came to the ER after falling and not being able to get up. His testicles were so engorged they came down to his knees with the width 1.5x greater than his thigh. Pen 15 was completely retracted into his scrotum. Had a CT scan that showed his entire large intestine, most of his small intestine, and his pancreas had herniated into his scrotum. You could auscultate his bowel sounds through his gonads. The surgeon said she had never seen anything like this and that it takes months to get that way, and only happens in third world countries with poor no access to medical care. She couldn't do much because his diaphragm had become so accustomed to the altered space in his abdomen that if she put his organs back in his abdominal cavity he wouldn't be able to breathe independently, would need to be ventilated permanently. The poor guy had mental health issues, I believe schizophrenia, which is why he was in the condition he was in. He was still able to pee all by himself. As a very junior doctor I looked after this mega alcoholic who needed ascites, fluid in the abdomen caused by liver failure, tapping out every month or so. He kept coming in a worse and worse shade of yellow-green, jaundice, needing more and more fluid removed. Still merrily drinking all the while. Well, the obvious happened. He died. Now he dead. So I wander onto the ward a few weeks later to find him sitting there in bed. Green as you like. Looking very alive. Turned out his was his twin. Also an alcoholic. Also not to live much longer. Pathologist here. Had a guy who had died suddenly and unexpectedly. I soon learned he was the recipient of a lung transplant about 15 years prior. When I opened the man up, his transplanted lung was upside down. I flipped the lung into the proper position. And bloop. It flipped right back to upside down. That was quite alarming. The surgeons who originally performed the transplant incorrectly attached the organ. When he by chance entered the correct position, the lung flipped over, causing his pulmonary artery to seal shut, resulting in his death. The man lived for 15 years with the lung that was dying to flip upside down. And it was only by sheer chance he didn't move in such a way that allowed it to do so until the fateful day of his death. It is one of the most fascinating cases I have ever witnessed. I have thought that after seeing some CT scans of lungs in severe COPD, it's like there is no normal lung tissue, just huge air pockets. It is hard to see how they exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide at all. Currently nursing a 65-year-old woman with severe COPD, Ventolin, corticosteroids and oxygen. Still smoking. Frightens the heck out of me. I threw my cigarettes away and hope my lungs can repair somewhat. A huge wake-up call. Also not a doctor, but my very elderly great-great-uncle just had a sextuple heart bypass. Had 4 prior heart attacks. How he was still functioning somewhat normally before his last heart attack I honestly don't know. Had a gentleman in his late 50s come in with multiple myeloma. Short history of progressively worsening breathlessness. Turned out he had a pulmonary embolism, blood clot in his lungs. He was a good candidate for surgery. So he had the blood clot removed, but unfortunately the clot had caused such bad issues with his heart, acute right heart failure, that he couldn't be weaned off the bypass machine. Instead, he went to IQ on ECMO, like a circuit for your heart and lungs outside the body to give your heart lungs time to rest. His chest was still open, cannulated centrally, but covered up with sterile stuff. After 3 days, he was booked to be weaned off the ECMO or at least have the tubes put in peripherally so his chest could be closed. Morning of the procedure while he's waiting to be moved. Somehow the tubing of the ECMO machine broke, oxygenator tube, and blood spilled all over the floor and he went into cardiac arrest. The cardiothoracics consultant had to do internal cardiac massage, basically CPR on the heart by squeezing it via his still open chest, until the circuit got fixed and he returned to a normal circulation. He ended up going to OT and having his chest closed, but he had more clots pulled out of his pulmonary arteries. Clots had recurred. At this point I thought this guy was utterly ducked. I figured if he even lived long enough to be woken up he'd have some degree of ischemic brain injury. After about 2 weeks the guy left ICU and a week later went to rehabilitation. Speaking, walking, cognitively largely intact. It was one of the most unbelievable things I've ever seen during my short career. Not a doctor, but a few years ago I was called into the hospital to go see my friend unexpectedly. Once there, the doctors told me my friend should be dead if not in a coma. What had happened was, that day my town had a beer fest on the main street. $20 all you could drink. We all partook, but I was sober at the time so I just enjoyed watching my friends get ripped. Fast forward to later that afternoon where all my friends had moved on to a friend's house but now hard alcohol was involved. I went home to by this point because I wasn't in the party mood. My good friend hit it hard though. He was gone. 3 sheets to the wind. Pissed off his ass. He ended up taking another friend's Marto scooter out for a joyride. Ended up wrecking it pretty damn hard onto his head. When I showed up at the hospital there were bloody rags everywhere. He was conscious and a big smile went across his sheet-faced mug when I walked in. Then he tried to escape, pulling IVs and wires off him, but I stopped him. He blew a .35 a few hours after the accident. He was a pretty heavy drinker. Tolerance saved him. Doctors told me they were in shock he wasn't in a coma or dead. Needless to say it humbled him out pretty well. Medic, not a doctor, but my first week or so on the job we picked up the town regular. Nurse didn't even need me to say anything but let me see his admission record. If there was one visit per line it probably would have been at least 10-15 pages. Multiple stabbings, shootings, beatings, drug and ego problems out the as he was set on fire twice and hit by 2 or 3 cars at highway speed. He was just unkillable. Edit. There, I punctuated properly. Are you happy now? Is this what you want? Exclamation point. Not a doctor. But I'm a nurse and my story is good too. I had a college student come into the unit on the night of their 19th birthday. They wanted to party, but had a test the next morning. One of their friends told them that if they took one Adderall for every drink that they had, they'd be sober by the morning. They had 15 shots and 15 20 milligrams Adderall tablets. If you were wondering. No. That does not make you sober. It does, however, make you rip off all your clothes in a hallway. Spit at the nurse that is trying to help you. Sheet all over everything. And then literally ducking die. Luckily for them, they weren't dead for good. We got them back and they spent most of their sophomore year of college in a hospital. With a hole in their neck. Learning how to walk again. Not a doctor, but I work in cardiology. And my doctors all do rotations at our hospital. Our hospital is a level 5 trauma and it's the closest hospital to a lot of rural area. So a lot of traumas that happen way out in the middle of nowhere end up at that hospital. This guy came in having been in a car accident. He was covered in road rash and his chest was more or less torn open. Apparently, as we all later learned, he'd been drinking and riding passenger in his friend's car. He wanted out of the car. His friend said no. So this guy, once again, very drunk, decided to try and jump out of the car window. He somewhat succeeded. But his shirt caught on the side view mirror and he got dragged until the driver stopped flipping out enough to come to his senses and stop. Not a doctor. I met a guy the other night who got hit by a jet ski. It broke his femur, crushed his shoulder and split his head. He was floating in the ocean for a while and said that after 30 minutes when he finally got into the ambulance, they took one look at him and said he didn't have much of a chance of making it to even the hospital because of the blood loss. I'm happy to say that he's alive and well. And after several surgeries is walking. I'm an ER nurse. Had a guy walk up to the front desk after hitting himself in the throat with a chainsaw. All the flesh of his neck was flayed open. I could see his trachea and his right jugular vein. If he had cutting just a tiny bit deeper, he would have sliced right into both. The only thing that saved him was that he was a big fat guy with a huge neck. A skinnier man would have died very unpleasantly. Saw a guy with a machete lodged up into his skull. Asked him if he was okay, not sarcastically. Just threw a generic question to check his ability to respond. He said yup. Not a doctor. My grandfather had a heart attack. He went in for a simple stent in his heart. Hours go by and we hear code blow over the intercom. Doctor comes out to tell us his left ventricle has an 1.5 inch tear in it. They had to transport him to another hospital ASAP. He died 3 times that night and went through 11 pints of blood. The surgeon successfully repaired the torn ventricle. They woke him up on my birthday and he sung me happy birthday. 3 weeks in cardiac IQ, my grandfather walked out. The surgeon told us for a man of 75 years to have lived through a left ventricle tear is unheard of. The doctor wrote a journal on him as well. He's still alive today. He even got his hip replaced a year after. Not a doctor or anything, but my grandmother has had 7 strokes. I couldn't help but laugh at the 7th one. She said, "AWW sheet. I'm having another stroke." She said this during a phone call abruptly. She's a very tough lady. She runs a garden and eats her in vegetables. Paramedic here. So many but 2 come to mind. Responded to a well-being check. Basically check on someone no one has heard from in a while. Get there and police advise the woman is dead and appeared to be so for a while. Middle of summer. Can smell her before getting close to house. Put on protective gear and air packs to move the body. She is rotting. Maggots and flies. Can see organs. We go to carefully move her into body bag and she opens her eyes and gasps. She was alive and rotting alive. We got her to the hospital alive and she lived for several days more. Second was a suicide. Shotgun to the face. He held it under chin but it slipped and he blew off front of face except one eye. He was awake and tried to talk but obviously couldn't. We ended up sedating and intubating, but he lived and walked out of hospital after tons of reconstructive surgery. I was in school to be a paramedic and I was doing my externship in an ER. A guy came in happily complaining about a sore on his belly that wouldn't heal. He was really pleasant and didn't seem to be in much pain. When he lifted his shirt, we could see his liver. My story is from a guy in the town I used to live in. Guy was working with an acetylene torch and passed out, unsure what precipitated it. Falling down on it while it was still operating. Burned a huge hole in his abdomen. Serious injuries. Had a patient who was stabbed multiple times. He was apparently leader of some gang and they thought he was conspiring against them. By the time we got him into the table he was cold. Lifeless. No pulse. Hours passed and we were sure he was gone. Shockingly, his dog jumped up on the table and he immediately gasped for air. Never seen anything like it. That snow was special. Paramedic. Not doctor. Had a patient who used a circular saw that snapped and a fragment broke off and penetrated the side of his neck. Scan at hospital showed it came ridiculously close to a main artery.